If you're trying to figure out how to actually integrate AI, improve your platform, or make the dev experience better for your team, then InfoQ Dev Summit Boston 2025 might be worth checking out. It's 2 days in June focused on the real-world side of adopting these technologies. You'll hear from senior engineers who've already been through it, what worked, what didn't, and what they do differently. It's built for teams who want to move past being inspired and start taking action now. Join us this June 9th and 10th. Learn more at devsummit.infoq.com.
Hello everybody, I'm InfoQ Pope, an InfoQ editor, and I had the pleasure of intersecting with Max at QCon the other days, and we said that we'll stay for a chat to understand better what happens in the platform space because he's so focused on multiple things. Max Körbächer, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you very much, Olympio. My name is Max Körbächer. I'm the founder of Liquid Reply. And what I've done the last years, it's actually a lot of different stuff. Right now, primarily working around platform engineering, how to build internal development platforms, but also going into sovereign cloud and how with open source and other technologies you can provide data sovereignty for your end users. But around that, I have founded some years ago the technical advisory group for environmental sustainability in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I'm today just the emeritus advisor, so I stepped down to give the much more energetic people space and keep pushing on the topic because it requires a lot of energy. I'm also part of the Linux Foundation Europe Advisory Board, take a look there into different initiatives and see how the organization can support the European open source ecosystem better and give it some room for develop its landscape. And yeah, I have a little bit background in the Kubernetes release team. I was there 3 years involved into different roles on the organizational side, and hosting now the 4th year in a row the Cloud Native Summit Munich, which was formerly known as a KCD Munich, and organize also some meetups around all the Kubernetes and cloud native platform engineering, and so on and so forth. Long story.
I was just trying to remember now all the encounters that we had in the last 4 years since I'm attending Kubernetes or QCon, mainly Europe, and then I remember that we met also in DevOps. And it seems that always we are riding with the wave or before that. As you mentioned, the environmental was a subject, and I remember a lot of the graphs that you had that remained in my mind. Last year, I don't remember the presentation to be honest, but I know that your company had something to do with Spin and Wasm, so connected there, so I'll leave that for later. But mainly, you always seem to be focused on community, urgent issues, and cloud native. So pretty much that's the topics that you're looking into. And this year, somehow you try to push all those things in one basket because you spoke how a platform can bring a company together. Please tell me more about that. I think you wrote also a book about it, right?
Exactly. So I wrote last year together with Andreas Grabner from Dynatrace and Hilary Lipsick from Red Hat a book about it called Platform Engineering for Architects. And it's actually, try to do what you explained. Platform engineering is not always about the technology. It's the technology itself is solvable, it's manageable, and if you cannot fix it, then give it 1-2 additional months and someone else will do. So I think we are in a very exciting time seeing the change in the technologies used and the approaches taken. But what always is missing is really like the missing glue between all of that. And I'm not talking about CI/CD pipelines and bash scripts and whatsoever. I mean here really the people and sometimes even the processes, the communication, and how do we come to the point that we build a platform. And in our book, we question quite often, do we need a platform? Do we need to go to the cloud? Is Kubernetes the right way? If so, are you sure about it, that it is doing the right thing for you? And we try to help throughout the book to find the relevant decision points so that in the end you know process-wise exactly what are you doing and come to the point that you integrate the different technologies with each other. But our key conclusion is you need to find a purpose for the platform. If you know what is the purpose for the platform, then you're good to go, right? If you cannot define it, if you just say like, I visited the last KubeCon and there was so many cool, fantastic talks about platform engineering and how they changed the world. Yeah, it might be like that this is true for many organizations, But just because for other organization has worked this approach, it doesn't mean that it will work for you too, right? And yeah, this is what we try to bring together and give more experience around.
That's very interesting because it's usually that kind of discussion. I mean, now we're discussing about platforms. Before that, we spoke about frameworks or different cloud providers and so on and so forth. And it's always the discussion. Well, it's basically a very shallow discussion comparing to what you mentioned, buy versus build and the other stuff. So what you said is we need a platform that has a purpose. When do you feel that, first of all, a platform is needed? What's the, let's say, most encountered goal for having a platform?
That's a difficult question because there is no generic answer to it. Many companies find this point for themselves in different reasons. There's a few public resources around it, like how Expedia measures the success of a platform, how GitHub measures the success for a platform, or how Toyota measure the success for a platform. And all three do it differently. So the one are looking into the development speed and how much contributions happen. So most likely how they end up building a platform or thought it's a good idea to build a platform is maybe because they had a problem in the delivery speed of their own software, right? While the others are looking into numbers, right? This running on an IDP saves us 5 million euro per year. Okay, so maybe it was a cost problem in the past, or maybe the software development cycle cost too much money, and so you're looking for how to improve it or increase the performance. Therefore, again, it's not no generic answer itself available for it, but that's the most interesting part to really find this point, to go through a lot of questions and identify like, okay, do I have problems in my software development process? Or do I believe I have too many bottlenecks in my organization while producing digital products? Maybe I have different hosting requirements and I cannot, throughout the whole organization, force everyone to understand 5 different hosting provider. So I need to find one way to do that. And so on and so forth. We have one customer at the moment who's focusing a lot in a very, very complex regulation they have to fulfill, a lot of compliance rules. And there's 2 ways how to do it, but the only way I believe there will be a long-term success is to build a platform around it, because it's easier to provide through one single endpoint all the compliance rules and ensure that in the development of the software and the delivery of the software and the operations of the software, this is always already there. The other way around is you have to enforce for every application this customer is going to migrate to the cloud, and it will be thousands of applications, and somewhere that the compliance rules are fitting. Now, some people will say like, hey, it's the same if I push it to the cloud or if I push it to, let's say, Kubernetes as a platform. Absolutely. But from our experience in the past, it's easier and faster to build a compliance framework around Kubernetes than to build a compliance framework around a cloud provider, or to be precise, within a cloud provider. And that's so because a cloud provider has tons of limitations and tons of things which not work the way you would like to have it. And at some point, you very often need to fall back to the good old engineering path and build it by yourself.
Thank you for that. Let me try to see if I understood it correctly. So what you're saying is that, like most of the technology that we faced, there is no size that fits them all. And it's important to look at what we have in our courtyard and make sure that we are solving a problem. Even if that problem is from the business perspective or the technological perspective, you should put a metric and ensure that building a platform will allow us to push that through. Okay, that sounds good. Well, I was just counting now the editions of QCon that I attended, and this was the 4th one. And I know that I was always thinking that technology should have another purpose, as you said, some goal, some major goal. And in the end, each business that we do, regardless of what we're building, it should have the ultimate reason to help our customers, to make them work better through our software. And this year, it was the first time when I heard at QCon during a keynote, I think it was the guys from eBay that were saying that they are thinking at the SRE level, so site reliability engineering level, about the user experience. And I was like, I heard the angels sing, I heard the fireworks going, and I said, finally, we are getting there. And would that be a sign of coming of age of the platform space? People are finally realizing how they should use it?
Well, I think it's a sign for Kubernetes to become mature, right? And then platforms on top of that are just representing this majority now and how rich it can be. Earlier this year was discussing with someone about it, that how boring Kubernetes have become. So there is not that much to talk about. And it's a lie, because there's tons of changes continuously happening. But where in the past you were always like, with every release, you were basically sitting in the evening and waiting that the release note's going on, and you're looking into and like, oh my God, do I need to kill all my Kubernetes cluster I've deployed in the last months, or can I just seamlessly upgrade? That time is over. So I think the community, but also the end users, but also the people who deliver additional services around it, like myself, are trying to find a way to explain that now. Like, look, Kubernetes is not the problem anymore. It's maybe sometimes a little bit of overhead, but it's not this big problem, this big headache. If you spend weeks on fixing your Kubernetes, you're doing something wrong, right? You should focus on deliver something that helps your organization to create a value. And this slowly comes one-to-one together into a platform. Now, platform is also not a good terminology, I need to say, right? We talk about different kind of platforms since 20 years, but a good old cloud native platform, having some containers somewhere in the heart, that's where at least our community feels well and feels good. And to slowly turn around from staring at the stack and looking more at the people who are using it, I think that's just like the step which we were a very long time waiting for, showing that the technology is rich enough so that we can now focus more on the user. Because, I mean, open source had always like this call of like, hey, it always looks a little bit ugly, it's always a little bit more complicated to use, and so on. But I think that changed now, right? And it gives now enough space, at least in the cloud native community, to say like, hey, we make now, in the end, open source sexy and usable, and give it a purpose, or give it the opportunity to deliver a purpose.
That sounds nice. I mean, I'm smiling because at the point when I was earlier in my career, I was following the shiniest thing, like pretty much everybody. And then you're looking for the boring technology. And I don't know why, but Yoda is speaking in my head like, learn you will, you Padawan. And now I feel that, as you said, the industry or the cloud native space is getting more mature. It's getting more boring, if you want. And a lot of other stuff are building on top of that. But there is always, at least in my circles, always the question to use Kubernetes or not to use Kubernetes. And that's a sign of the maturity of the engineers. When would you think it would be feasible for somebody to think about Kubernetes? What would be the scale that you have to look into to just say, we are going the Kubernetes way, regardless of if it's through a cloud provider or you're just implementing it yourself?
Difficult. I would say to come to the point that Kubernetes makes sense, it's more like an evolution, right? If you're a gigantic enterprise company, you will find enough problems and use cases to drop in Kubernetes and make at some point your life easier. Often you have the other problem that you then have like 10 initiatives at the same time, and practically you're wasting 9 times more the money than you actually would like to save into. If you are a medium-sized company and the biggest problem for you is like how to host my ERP system and maybe a website and then like 10 internal tools, Kubernetes maybe is also not the really right solution for you, right? If you're a startup and you do not have money, no, don't start with Kubernetes. It's not that Kubernetes itself is drastically more expensive, but you need to spend decent amount of engineering time, and you need to hire at least 1 or 2 person that are in some way good with that tool to make your infrastructure work. So there you can focus on going serverless, for example, right? When you want to have a prototype and looking into fast bringing up MVP, that's fine to go serverless. But you can also, at the same point in time, pull out then the companies who built everything on serverless in the past and are now migrating back to container and try to get into Kubernetes, because it has reached such a scale that they lost the control of their own system, because serverless then is also not the most easiest thing to observe in regards of like what's going on. So there's tons of cases where it really doesn't make sense to go for Kubernetes. Earlier in the Kubernetes book club, we discussed also about the same question, like where we really should not bring that. And my co-author brought the example like, well, if you use embedded systems, you also should not use Kubernetes. And it's like, yeah, well, I mean, for me, obviously embedded systems are very far off from using Kubernetes, but IoT itself and the whole edge deployment topic is a very huge thingy in the cloud native ecospace. There's our own user group around it. There's our own telco group around it, which also does edge. So it's actually reasonable to think about it. Where does it make sense and where it doesn't make sense? So for me, it's another question like where you really can use it. Well, if you want to either build a platform to host thousands or hundreds of random applications that are not very special, I show you quote unquote, a platform can be a good approach to unify all the different core services which you need. Security, compliance, make the life for operations easier, unify how you deploy software, how you keep it up and running, blah, blah, blah. All cool. Good way. The other way, and that's is for me the ideal use case, if I have one large digital product that is built of many different services, many different components, and they all need to, in some way, wipe together. They need to grow and get smaller. They need to be fault resistant. They need to allow a seamless global upgrade from versions, distributing around the world, whatever. Then Kubernetes is like, I would say, plays its competencies the best.
Okay, fair enough. To summarize is if you have very small applications, go for another solution. Probably there are better ways out there than to do it. But if you need to normalize your deployments and you have huge operations, it will help it. And this reminds me of a talk that I attended last year from Mercedes-Benz. And they were talking about having thousands, I don't remember exactly, in the lower thousands, so 2 to 4,000 developers. And they had a team of 6 platform engineers that was able to build the platform and deliver to all of those because they had a very proper way of doing stuff and a very disciplined way of doing it. So that was eye-opening for me. But I'll go back with, let's say, not challenging, but interesting perspective. So you mentioned IoT, and IoT is growing. I have a piece of that pie as well on my plate as well. And as you said, telco is, well, a lengthier edge because it's big, they have other resources, and it's more different types of scenarios. But I am in the smaller scale IoT where we have sensors deployed all over the place and stuff like that. But still, I'm thinking about a platform that will allow me to deal with heterogeneous ecosystems because you have multiple embedded software and then you have different versions and stuff like that. And my feeling is that there is this intersection point that seems to be more and more often now, and that's WebAssembly and Kubernetes. I know that you guys work on the SpinCube, if I remember correctly, as a connector.
Yeah, partially. So initially my team developed something called the Wasm operator. The idea was just like to make it super duper simple to get started with WebAssembly on Kubernetes. And in the end, the guys make such a fantastic job that it was even too boring to make a demo because it was like literally like 2 calls on the CLI and you have WebAssembly running on your Kubernetes cluster. The thing is, it was not production ready. It was lean, super simple, super easy, but as so often, it's an experimental thingy. And my team collaborated together with Fermi and Microsoft and SUSE on bringing that to the next level, to make it production ready, to put their reliability into it so that it's robust enough for even production use cases. And yeah, in the end, I do not want to say we developed Spin or SpinCube. That would be incorrect, but my team helped on some small minor portion to make that up.
Nice. Well, it's a good company to be in. SUSE, Microsoft, and Fermion. Fermion has a cloud focused on WebAssembly. So, what's your thought? Will WebAssembly make your footprint smaller? How much difference would it actually make?
First of all, I believe it would make our life in some way easier because it just really takes out of the container all the things which can go wrong. And all the dirty thing which you maybe would like to do as a developer, as a sysadmin, right? So it's for me not about the size of the container. It's also interesting, but it's really more about the security factor that you have there, compiled binary format that you can ship around. And practically it cannot do that much if you do not give explicit rights to it. So I think that's one of the biggest parts which I really love in it. And in terms of size or performance, or even turn back to the sustainability topic, we looked into it. WebAssembly doesn't need to be more resource efficient or more sustainable because on the one hand side, the execution time of the software stays more or less the same. There's no speed or improvement just because you run a WebAssembly. The only difference is that a WebAssembly container can start in 110 to 150 milliseconds. So in a blink of an eye, you can start a container. what does it allow us is that a container doesn't need to run continuously, where a regular Docker container is often also very fast. Let's say it needs maybe a second, sometimes less, sometimes more, but it's way larger in the amount of data which needs to be stored for a container. Yes, you can make a Docker container or a standard container very small, a couple of megabytes, maybe 100 megabyte, whatsoever. That would be kind of best practice. The reality for almost everything what you can see in large companies and in medium-sized companies, even more awful, that a container has several hundred megabytes or gigabytes and sometimes needs dozens of seconds to start up, sometimes even minutes to get ready. And so that's where, on the other hand side, WebAssembly really boils it down to like, here's your code, execute it. There's no bullshit going around. There is no weird scripts that are triggered in another container and preheat something. No, you are forced to make your software just starting and running. That's it. And through that, yes, the container of a WebAssembly is comparably small. Some say you can go down to kilobyte. I think a few megabyte, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 megabyte is a good medium. Sometimes it can also become bigger. That's not the thing. But it become very, very small in this regards, right? So the technology itself is very cool. I really like it because it takes away all your headache of like maintaining and patching and hardening the operating system in a container. Just really to like, here's your software. You can use it everywhere. You can run it alongside every other container. But the platforms, the cloud provider, but also like your own platforms at home, do not support the speed of the starting of a WebAssembly container. So it's cool that I can start and stop a WebAssembly container in milliseconds, but it doesn't help me if a node on AWS needs 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes to start up, right? So this is the problem in the end. And so either the cloud providers needs to start providing services, again, in like the serverless space maybe, that can catch up with WebAssembly. And I believe that will sooner or later really happen. Or you, and this is my personal perspective where my sustainability dude comes out again, especially for a little bit slower platforms in an enterprise context, I see it more like as a possibility to fill up blanks. So a Kubernetes platform is only sustainable or good in their resource consumption if it goes up to almost 100% of the resources. Only then is the resource consumption efficient, right? And so you can fill it up. You can have your static workload, the heavy babies running on the bottom, then the little bit more flexible apps running on top. And then to fill up the planks, you can throw in, for example, stuff like WebAssembly container, because you can kill them very fast and put them somewhere else up without that you even recognize it.
Okay, that's a nice thought. So to summarize those points, you mentioned that WebAssembly can be very fast if we use it properly, but companies that are just bloating their WebAssembly binaries or whatever they are called, they should look to something else. And in order to make things really sustainable and, well, currently probably need to mention that sustainable both financially and green, because they are interconnected, it will mean that we have to use the whole resources that we have. And WebAssembly can be built on top of it, because if it starts very, very fast, it allows it to just be spin left and right, regardless of people seeing it or not. Okay, interesting. But this is an interesting space, and we can talk for hours about it. But in the end, this is only the runtime, right? So it's the basic stuff, and then we have the application on top of it. And you mentioned that currently you're looking more into internal developer portals. And that's again another buzzword, because I remember that last year Backstage had the most developers allocated for building it. What's your experience with developer portals?
Well, I think we need to draw there a very, very big line. In my wording, it's always an internal development platform, not a portal, because there are not that much portals. Either you go for Backstage if you want to go open source, Red Hat has a wrapper around it. All other solutions are commercial solutions. And we need to be aware that as cool as Backstage is, it is an incredible heavy child. Many, many organizations are starting with it, are failing with it, and I get very, very mad about it. We were like a few weeks ago on a platform engineering executive roundtable, and almost everyone reported they have around 3 to 5 people working on their developer portal, and they don't see really any kind of benefit coming out of it. And the problem with this standpoint is that it's then locked into this platform engineering at all, and building platforms in the second row. And that's, for me personally, a huge problem. That's why I always like to take it down, saying, like, first we talk about an internal development platform, because it's bigger than just a UI. And the platform itself can provide you tons of features and capabilities and being adjusted to whatever you need. And then you are back to the example which you mentioned from Mercedes-Benz Tech Innovation, where they, with a fairly small team, can serve a huge amount of developers. And they're not alone by themselves. Customers we are working with, they have similar or larger scales. And we can see this, practically this ratio. Like, we always say, like 5 to 5. So 5,000 developers requires 5 platform engineers, right? So it's, when I look at the organization which we support, we usually come up to the scale of these teams in this regards. And if you need more people, then you have done something wrong with your platform. Something like that. For sure, it's also always complicated, but that's, for me, a little big example. But yeah, developer portals itself, a huge buzzword. I think sometimes it's cooked too hot than what it can really, really deliver. For my QCon demo, from a talk which I gave on QCon, the demo, I also spin up an own IDP with the Canoe project. I can tell you everything runs very smoothly. Argo runs smoothly. Argo workflows comes up like a chime. External DNS, no problem. AWS EKS on an auto mode, also no problem. Everything cool. Backstage killed me for weeks. I literally spent dozens of hours to make that little, sorry, I don't know, I'm getting angry here. Fill in some bad words which come up to your head first to make it up and running. And then when it was up and running, you want to fix something, you want to integrate something else, compile it, push it, proc again. It's like, man, it can't be. So I can really understand the pain around it. And that's why I always like to say an IDP is not a backstage. An IDP is a platform that is used and loved by your developers. Then you have it. One of our biggest customers runs everything in GitHub. That's an IDP. They do not have a portal. And the developer portal is developed in a different team, maintained by a different team. And I do not want to say no one cares about it, but they do their thing, but the platform itself runs without it. Right? So it's not really needed for making your organization successful in this space.
I zoned out a bit when you heard that developers have to be happy, and that's one of the newest additions in terms of metrics that people are talking. So we had Dora, and then we had Space, and then out of a sudden we thought about DevX. And in the end, I think that's important. If the people are happy with what they are having, and as you said, they avoid the frustration that comes out into building something, that allows them to be very creative and then deliver the value that they want. Because in the end, for me, the platform, the tool that we use, regardless of what label we put it, should be that connecting bridge between the operational space and the development space. And that allows us to build bridges in the organization and break down the silos. Because in the end, that's what we tried for so long to do it. And now my feeling is that we're closer than ever in achieving that. Okay, we touched a lot of topics. And you are on the bleeding edge with everything. So first of all, allow me to ask you if I should have asked you something else, and what would be the topic that I should have been keen to ask you?
Well, I'm happy that you didn't touch AI.
Well, everybody touches AI, so we can leave it there for now.
With that few words, it was touched. Thanks, next. I think it's very complicated to think about what's next because it happens so much at the same time right now. I think what we will see, and that's what the organizations currently most struggle with, is still to adopt cloud. So we are very far ahead in the platform engineering community. We treat cloud just like a API that are tame. Yes, I need to know some limits and whatsoever, but usually we don't give so much energy into it and just fix the problem and focus back on what delivers value to the users. But I think that's still one of the largest problems which we see with enterprises that they're working on. Beside that, I think we can do way more better in the space of like providing application platforms, right? So when we talk about an IDP, we usually talk just about infrastructure and CI/CD and security and compliance and whatsoever. If you look into all kind of reference architecture, they always look into like resources and cloud provider and all the infrastructure part. Almost nothing looks into the application level. For this one, I really loved in the past Heroku, and I think they are currently back on track. Somehow, after the acquisition of Salesforce, they vanished for a few years, and now they are back and shiny and put out their nose and like, hey, here we are. We're still a cool platform. Come to me. And I think you see similar platforms like Versal, for example, which focus 100% only on one problem. Give me your application, I put it somewhere and make you happy. And I think in that space, we really still miss good solutions that are putting the right perspective into it. But also because it's complex to make people in that space really happy in the end, because they either want to touch the infrastructure or they don't want to touch the infrastructure, or the application becomes so complicated that I need 500 different configurations around it and so on and so forth. So I can understand that there's no simple solution to it. On the other hand side, we have the same for all the Kubernetes and infrastructure space. We have thousands of config possibilities and millions of compositions that are possible and so on. So I think there will come up something in some time, but at the moment we don't see anything.
Okay, so let me see if I understand it correctly. I don't know if you saw it, but I had a large light bulb on top of my head when you said about internal developer platforms and application space, because the thing that I just thought about is how cool would that be to have the, call it as you want, the infrastructure guys, the infrastructure team working together with the enablement team and delivering interesting building blocks that everybody can use in a uniform manner. And then we are just making things fast, secure, compliant, because whether we like it or not, compliance is a very important topic. Is that around your thoughts as well?
Yeah, in some way. I mean, that's the promise which we carry around since years and decades of doing cloud, right? But the reality is it really isn't. We are getting more and more far away from it. We add always layers on the bottom. I don't know, maybe we hope to fill up the whole thing until we reach the top. Maybe that's the idea behind it. But we don't think about like what we can add from the top to it. That's why I like other projects in this space and also WebAssembly, because it forces me to reduce some part of the infrastructure. As said, even just to take out the operating system of a container, that's already a big change. It sounds stupid, but how many organizations spends thousands of euros on build hours and people on building so-called golden images and secure images? And then the next developer comes around the corner, wants to use, I don't know, Rust, and suddenly nothing works again, right? And so I think there's like, for example, Wasm Cloud, a very cool approach, also an open source project, also part of the CNCF, that can run practically everywhere. If you like Kubernetes, throw it on Kubernetes. If you like VMs, throw it on VMs. If you want to have it somewhere else, it can run somewhere else. There's no real limit around it. But they have taken out every other complexity and just like take your application and make it deployable, make it robust. If some connection drops somewhere, the tool will try to find other connection paths. If it doesn't happen, it waits until it gets back connection and so on. It almost feels like a serverless platform, but it isn't a serverless platform. And it almost feels like a distributed ledger technology, but it isn't a DLT. It's not a blockchain, right? It sits somewhere in the middle. And I think there we can see in the next year, I guess, more development, more interest to try this out.
Okay. One of the elephants in the room passed by, and that's AI. We left it pass by us. But there is another one, and I wouldn't have mentioned it if you didn't have touched on that, and that's sovereign cloud. Unfortunately, the way how the things are looking, that's something that probably people will start asking if they didn't already. So, what are we doing? Are we cutting the transatlantic cables and building new clouds, or are they still already existing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we shouldn't do the China move, right? And as we learn, trading relationships are very important. But I think what people slowly come to the point is that it doesn't make sense to just ride on one horse in the end, or just follow one horse, and that we need to find to our own strengths back in some way. And that always sounds a little bit political, but it's really like not about they versus us or whoever. It's more about like we have lost in the last years a lot of our capabilities and we run behind the technological innovation. This has multiple reasons. It's from the investment structures, which are way better in US, and people just give you a couple of $1 million. On the other hand side, they have a problem with money. So it's not good to give with the full hand money if you do not have the other had enough money in your hand, right? Nevertheless, I don't think we should cut the cables, but we need to be aware of that. That's the very fascinating, interesting part in sovereign cloud itself. You have a legal aspect, which you cannot fulfill with any solution existing, except it is provided by 100% European entity-owned organization that has zero connections to the US or China or Russia also. All of them wants to sneak peek into what you're doing there. That doesn't matter so much. And the other part is you need to ensure that you have your data all the time encrypted. And I think this is right now the time not only of sovereign cloud and sovereignty about your data, but also confidential computing. I think that in many discussions which I see, it's like the second or third thing which comes up is like, it's not enough to just legally do the things right, but we also need to protect it from end to end. And I think that's the both things which we see at the moment coming up. Besides that, cloud providers are developing. I'm super glad that we can work with Stack It Together in the German market or Scaleway more international and have tons of other options out there. We also can discuss about like what is a cloud provider, right? Because we have a lot of providers, infrastructure as a service provider, for example, that have almost cloud-like services, but not always someone would take them as a cloud provider. But I really like to see that there's a push. I really like to see that people challenge the new infrastructures which are getting built, try to understand how they're working, how they're different, maybe getting even frustrated about it. That's also my experience in some part. But I also like always to say the cloud as we know is broken because it's just like a digital version of how you have done IT the last 60 years before. So maybe it's time to really rethink how we are doing it. This will not happen for the large enterprises. They're stuck in their structures. But everyone else can maybe find a way to do it a little bit better and not spend countless hours in networking and firewalling and whatsoever, and just find ways to really focus on providing, again, more cool features and spend time in being innovative and create new stuff.
Okay, so for me, how it translated from my personal experience and what we discussed is that the sovereign movement is more about aligning with our values, our European values, and ensuring that the data is safe, it's computed safe, and it's stored safe inside the European Union, or in each entity of the European Union where you need to have the data. And that's mainly it. Keep your data close and ensure that it's used by the people that actually have the right of using it properly. Okay. Well, I think this is a nice sum up of what we discussed up to now, looking to a bright future. Vielen Dank, Max. Thank you for your time and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for having me. I wish you a nice evening.
Thank you.